So it was in the winter of 2015. I was at the house of my parents with my wife and my kids. And everybody was sick, really sick. I was the last one standing. Then I got this first ping, this first message from a person who called himself John Doe and asked if I would be interested in data.
We turn now to the bombshell causing shockwaves around the world, the so-called Panama Papers.
What may be the largest leak of secret documents in history.
Massive document leak allegedly showing how world leaders and the mega rich hide billions of dollars.
A new report which finds 8 billionaires own as much wealth as the poorest half of the world's population.
The papers paint a picture of widespread corruption and tax evasion.
Now we have journalists stepping in, trying to tear down those barriers of secrecy and exposing what is happening behind closed doors.
The revelation now is kicking off a worldwide investigation.
The whole issue here is about secrecy. People can create shell corporations and secretly move money around.
Worldwide estimates suggest tens of trillions of dollars are hidden in offshore accounts.
What's really shocking is the fact that 12 current or former heads of state are being accused in these papers.
A journalist investigating the Panama Papers has been killed, sending other journalists into hiding for fear of their safety.
The law firm is denying any wrongdoing, but this scandal, the Panama Papers, is just beginning.
For the record, I do not work for any government or intelligence agency, directly or as a contractor, and I never have. My viewpoint is entirely my own. Income inequality is one of the defining issues of our time. It affects all of us, the world over. Still, questions remain. Why? And why now? The Panama Papers provide a compelling answer to these questions. Massive, pervasive corruption. It's not a coincidence that the answers come from a law firm. Mossack Fonseca used its influence to write and bend laws worldwide, to favor the interest of criminals over a period of decades.
In the first days, it was so fascinating because this window in a world opened where nobody had ever looked in. I always wanted to write. I wanted to become a novelist, but that didn't really work out, so I intended to become a sports writer, and that also didn't work out, and here I am, so.
What interested you? What got you into journalism?
Well, I think it's more or less the sense for injustice in some way. We founded our own paper in Rosenheim, where I come from, because we had the feeling that all the media there are very much right-wing orientated, and that important stories are not really told. The fact that the data was Mossack Fonseca, which I knew as a black hole. They work with all kinds of criminals. All the information that people who want to keep their secrets put in there are just disappearing from the public. So I knew the company, and I thought, if this guy has access to the innerst of Mossack Fonseca, I'm the guy who wants to have it.
Mossack Fonseca, una compañía con vasta experiencia y prestigio, construidos en base a una trayectoria que data desde el año 1977 como firma de abogados a nivel mundial. La capacidad del grupo, su cobertura global y amplia experiencia permitirán brindarle a su compañía un mundo de soluciones a su servicio.
Mossack Fonseca is a law firm from Panama, and their business is secrecy. If you have about 1,000 euros, you can buy an offshore company. It's quite easy. And then you can even buy chain directors, which means that all of the business you do, someone else is signing, someone else is doing the business. So no one actually knows that you own stuff, and you can hide all your businesses.
There's a world that is only accessible for the powerful and the richest, where they hide their money, where they enable money laundering, corruption, and actually the plundering of whole continents.
Since 2015, the richest 1% have been more wealthy than the rest of the world's population combined. Now, Oxfam says the poorest 10% have seen their income increase by less than $3 a year between 1988 and 2011.
If we have streets that are in not a good condition, if we do not have enough preschool places or good schools, or if we do have to pay too much money for universities, that is due to the fact that there are so many people out there that are avoiding and evading taxes. That's a problem that is concerning every country all around the world and every one of us.
In the first days, it didn't seem like this is the biggest leak in history of journalism. It only was, this seems to be a really good story.
The amount of data that Sebastian and me received grew and grew. It was really like an addiction. I spent night and day clicking through the data. When we then found the first names of heads of state, heads of government.
We found, the best friend of Vladimir Putin. We found the Icelandic Prime Minister, even celebrities. We always found something that I thought, this is really worth reporting on. If you find money tied to Bashar al-Assad and to Vladimir Putin and to other dictators, then you somehow have the feeling, maybe it's not a good idea that only I know.
Some colleagues ask us, actually, are you crazy sharing a scoop, giving away something our newspaper could have alone? But by sharing, we enable this investigation to be something big and to make our investigations better. So we reached out to the ICIJ in Washington and shared the data.
ICIJ was created 20 years ago, and we can say that its mission is to defeat the traditional model of the lone wolf investigative reporter. The lone wolf investigative reporter is all for herself or himself, and so ICIJ was created as a network of investigative reporters in more than 60 countries who collaborate on stories that are too complex and that need to be told from a collective perspective, from a collaborative perspective, that need to be told across borders in collaboration.
The general meeting ends at 3:45.
I am originally from Argentina. I went into journalism fairly young. At 18, decided to be a journalist. I saw a lot of inequality in my country growing up, a lot of corruption, and I wanted to do something about it, but not from an activist point of view, but from a journalistic point of view. When we started receiving the data from Süddeutsche Zeitung and analyzing it and realizing that it was connecting to 200 countries, that there were dozens of public figures and prime ministers and presidents and princesses and queens, and we have to do the biggest investigation we have ever done to do justice to this data.
I have to admit, my first thought was skepticism, because I thought, well, we've done these stories on offshore before. We'd done, I think at that stage, 4 or 5 of them. And I was wondering how it was going to be possible to get all the media partners interested in doing another story about offshore. But we really had cracked the offshore world. Even though we had done previous stories, we didn't have this kind of information before. And I really thought it was a breakthrough.
11.5 million documents. Do you have all these complex kind of documents, some that you're familiarized with, but sometimes you also have databases within them?
They were mostly emails, PDFs, and everything else. But because there were so many millions of documents, we had to make it easy for journalists to search through them. Producing data sets, for example, all the clients of Mossack Fonseca, all the intermediaries, clients per country, and so on.
Every company has a number and a folder, so it's very easy to navigate actually in the original data.
Then we upload it to a platform that we call Blacklight. And this becomes like Google, where you have a search box. So you're actually able to figure out whether some names of people of public interest in your country are present in that data.
One big danger here was that someone was feeding us the documents and then would perhaps slip in some false information into the documents. We wanted to make sure that wasn't happening. We had done some work on Mossack Fonseca in the past, so we actually had a set of documents that we could compare the information we were getting from the new source, the John Doe source, with what we had before. So my early stage was to keep questioning everything and to make sure that we were jumping every hurdle.
We decided to reconstruct a database of the companies and the shareholders connected to Mossack Fonseca. It's called Linkurious, and you just start typing people's names or companies' names, you will get a circle called a node. And if you click on it, it starts expanding. And then you will be able to see how many companies a person is connected to or who are the shareholders behind a company.
We literally took months to make available this information to the journalists, and we were making it available in batches up until the very end. I think the last batch of information of documents was released perhaps a couple of months before publication.
We have 1.7 terabyte at the moment. We brought 1.5 to ICRJ yesterday.
You don't just call great reporters that you have heard of. You have to call people that you know you can work with, who are excellent reporters, but also people that you can trust. We had been getting to know the team at McClatchy, and they ticked every box. They really wanted to work as a team.
Who's surprised that bad guys hide their money? Nobody was saying that was the surprise. The surprise is you pull this veil back and you see this is how they do it. Everything you thought was happening, here's the evidence, it is. I'm a former South America bureau chief for the company, and Mossack Fonseca is a Latin company, Latin clients, and so it was an area that I could help with. I grew up in Ecuador as a child. I grew up a little different than the most Americans because I saw the poverty. I saw kids with no legs begging in front of the soccer stadium on Saturdays, and so this different world exists. But to have it so spelled out clearly where you can start to see these connections, and then the rest of it is kind of the legwork. Okay, they have an offshore account, so what? What do you do from there? What more can you say about that?
Usually as a reporter, you have tips, you have some kind of roadmap of where you want to go with the story. With this, we had absolutely no roadmap.
We weren't the big guys, we were the ones who tried to break stories that the big guys didn't have. We were the underdogs to some degree. It was also something that we had to kind of sell to our company at the time because they had decided that they were going to shut their foreign bureaus. They were wondering what value foreign news would have to their readers. Why are people going to care that the rich don't pay their taxes and crooks are crooks? Everyone knows that. What he didn't understand is that this was such an enormous amount of data. It was revealing a whole world. It wasn't just a story about offshores. It was the goods. We had the goods on how it worked.
I'm a nerd about journalism. I have been a journalist for over 15 years, and I look at myself as a person that wants to be the pipeline for minority groups to publish their story, to ask questions inside the government and find answers for those groups. I got a call from Marina Walker, the deputy director of ICIJ. She asked me, do you want to work on a leak? And we have a lot of Icelandic names in the leak. And we have your prime minister there and his wife. And at that moment, everything froze in front of me. I thought to myself, wow, this is going to be a bomb here in Iceland. Nobody knew about his offshore company called Wintris. If you Googled Wintris before the Panama Papers, you couldn't find anything. And the Prime Minister hadn't been transparent about his involvement into the offshore world.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to be here today at Iceland Investment Forum. It takes time for any given country to resurface from political turmoil after a large-scale economic crisis. We have already made significant progress, and I'm convinced that the policy this government has put forward is a sound one and that it will bring further benefits.
I have to admit that when you hear the Prime Minister is involved, his wife, and other big business people in Iceland, very powerful people, then you start to think about what will happen.
Hope to see you and your money in Iceland.
At this point, we continued on to London, and I met with The Guardian because I knew that if they were involved, that it would be easier to convince other media partners to get involved.
This was a really important leak. I think we've had 3 super leaks this century so far. We had WikiLeaks, where we got the kind of unmediated view of the most powerful country on earth, the United States.
The biggest leak of U.S. military secrets ever. Website WikiLeaks hit the send button on some 400,000 sensitive documents about the Iraq War.
Then we had Snowden, who came along, who proved that all of our data is being collected all the time, that we're being surveilled.
I, sitting at my desk, certainly had the authorities to wiretap anyone, from you or your accountant to a federal judge to even the president if I had a personal email.
He sort of lifted what I would call mass surveillance. And then we had the Panama Papers. We had emails between the law firm and what they called their clients, which typically meant other intermediaries, banks, lawyers, accountants all over the world. We had passport scans, we had kind of incorporation documents, we had a lot of postage stamps from these various exotic locations. Pretty much all of them set up so that no one could kind of peer inside. And suddenly we had a kind of treasure trove of stuff. I've been on the Guardian for about 20 years, 12 years as a foreign correspondent, bouncing around the world, Afghanistan, Iraq, Berlin, and then I was posted to Moscow, where I kind of really plunged into what you might call kind of post-Soviet murk, corruption, espionage, Vladimir Putin, his money, question mark, and so on.
You're not just going in, going, oh, look, here's the whole story in black and white for me. It's a lot of detective work of painstaking piecing together. You don't just dump stuff. You find the narratives, you make them matter to people. I joined The Guardian in 2011 as telecoms correspondent, and because I speak French, I was pulled into an investigation into HSBC Bank and its Swiss operation, which was the first ICIJ investigation that I'd worked on.
A massive investigation by media outlets including France's Le Monde and Britain's Guardian newspaper. They've revealed that HSBC's Swiss private banking arm has helped thousands of wealthy clients to evade tax.
It was a big story over here, and then I got brought in to do the Panama Papers a few months after that.
I knew that there were companies in Malta that were using Mossack Fonseca to set up companies in Panama for their clients. But what I never imagined was that I would find the name of a cabinet minister in there. There were 3 companies that were set up. The names of Konrad Mizzi and of Konrad Mizzi's wife, Sai Mizzi, and Konrad Mizzi's children appeared in the documentation. There were never any names given for the third company, eGrant. My mother, through different sources, one of whom worked in a bank where documentation related to this third company was kept, worked out that the shares were being held in the name of the Prime Minister's wife, Michelle Muscat. I think that's when we realized that what we were dealing with in Malta was a system of state capture, that every institution of the state has been captured by this gang. They're laundering money, they're laundering campaign funding, and they're going to go to prison for a long time. I was sure of that at the time.
This is all about secrecy and the ability to hide your money, your assets.
The rich and the super rich, together with most sort of multinational corporations, essentially exited quietly, sort of slipped off stage from the messy business of universal taxation some time ago. Before I started work on the Panama Papers, I thought that offshore was a kind of small, minor, who cares, little aspect of the economic system we knew not so much about. And after reading the Panama Papers, I realized it is the economic system. It is the system. $8 trillion is stuffed in tax havens. Western countries, including the US, are losing about $200 billion a year in tax revenues.
We were still debating at that time whether tax avoidance was a matter of public interest or not, or could you simply do what you liked with your money. But what it did establish for us, the scale of it, it just showed you there were underground rivers of money washing around the globe, unbeknownst to most people.
We are writing about an incredibly damaging part of our economy that has become so central and so mainstream that is creating French Revolution levels of inequality and injustice. And the challenge we have is to be able to bring this story home to people, to show them that this story matters to you, affects your life, and guess what? You are the victim in this story.
Banks, financial regulators, and tax authorities have failed. Decisions have been made that have spared the wealthy, while focusing instead on reining in middle and low-income citizens. The collective impact of these failures has been a complete erosion of ethical standards, ultimately leading to a novel system we still call capitalism, but which is tantamount to economic slavery. Hopelessly backward and inefficient courts have failed. Judges have too often acquiesced to the arguments of the rich, whose lawyers, and not just Mossack Fonseca, are well-trained in honoring the letter of the law, while simultaneously doing everything in their power to desecrate its spirit.
Ben, hey, it's Kevin. Since we have outstanding matters, give me a shout back. Bye. One of the things that is particularly interesting about the Panama Papers is you have all the email traffic, all these different people who appear in these email threads going back and forth on how to handle something. You see their personalities and who the compliance department, who is more serious about really cracking down, and the tension between management and compliance. So at one point, the Geneva office basically says, you know, they found that you've got a Syrian tied to Bashar al-Assad, who's now under sanction and everything at the time of these emails. And the Geneva office says, well, HSBC is still working with them, so I don't see why we shouldn't. You know, so you kind of see what their thinking is. You know, they're willing to work with bad money, they just have to be clean about it.
The customer said, I need to do the following in terms of hiding money. Will you do it for me? And Mossack Fonseca, and these are all on the records, would say, sure, we'll give you a Panamanian corporation, a trust bank account somewhere else, and not to worry, nobody will follow the trail. To simplify, to explain how this system works in a really understandable way, I worked on a case involving a drug trafficker in the Cayman Islands. His lawyer in Miami said, go see Joe Blow in the Cayman Islands and he'll set you up.
We've got everything a man could want.
Joe Blow in the Cayman Islands sets up a corporation. The corporation opens a bank account. The guy who is the drug trafficker now puts money in the bank account and lets the lawyer in Cayman control that bank account. There comes a moment 6 months later.
You took out the money? Yeah.
He wants to move the money to hide the trail, and he calls the lawyer and says, well, we need another bank account in the name of another corporation, and I want to transfer the money from Corporation A to Corporation B, and let's do it so the amounts don't match. And then the moment comes when he says, I want to use the money, and he goes back to the lawyer in Cayman, and he says, we're going to have the bank that has the second transfer lend the money to the guy's brother who owns a massage parlor in Houston. That way it'll look like a loan, non-taxable. Where did you get it? I borrowed it. The whole thing looks like it's perfectly clean and perfectly okay.
Hey, how you doing? I was kind of skeptical because I wasn't a big fan of inviting so many colleagues. I thought, you know, maybe 50 or 100 is really enough. And we knew around 50 or 100 from previous investigations, so we trusted them.
Did they know that you got this data, or this data is out there available to someone?
Well, we made something up here just to see the relation.
I wondered if we could keep this whole project secret. There's one basic rule, and that might sound rude, but it's important. That's shut up and encrypt. We always told our colleagues that you cannot tell anyone, not your wife, not your best friend, nobody, about this project, and you have to encrypt everything.
You know, my primary interest at this stage of the investigation was to establish public interest. So we only were interested in public figures, you know, politicians, business people, anyone with a public profile. And you know, the fastest way to find that out is to give a set of documents from Indonesia to an Indonesian journalist, give a set of documents from Iceland to an Icelandic journalist. They would identify pretty quickly who was worth looking at on this list and who wasn't worth looking at.
There's a part in the website where they actually brag about their good internet data security. We have very good security. This is not going to happen to us.
I was angry that nobody had called me and I wasn't involved. You know, I have never collaborated in a giant thing like that. I collaborate within my newsroom, sometimes with like one, you know, an outside group. Most news organizations are not global. And then I think this becomes much more important because it seems like more and more the best stories are global. This was like a ringing affirmation that you can actually do it, and you can do it at scale.
This is we are building up long lists of persons and companies. Then the ICHA said, for example, we need somebody in Panama. And I said, I don't trust anybody in Panama.
No puedo hacer infografía, no. Lo que hay que sacar como un extracto de cuáles son, o sea, en donde están ellos.
Pero así que sea info.
When I first looked at the assignment that we were going to do, I flipped. And the first document I saw, it was an invoice. And that's when I said, oh my God, this is huge. Because invoices are probably one of the most private documents within a law firm. And then when I see the names of people I know in the database, I mean, I was really scared because I knew what was coming behind that. And I knew the consequences that this was going to have.
Rita Vasquez was also a lawyer in the offshore services industry for many years. So when we learned that, we were fascinated. We had the opportunity to work with an insider who understands this industry from within.
Seeing my friends and people that I care for in that data really made me wanted to go deeper into the project. As a newspaper organization, it is not our duty to tell if a private person is doing something wrong with their own money. But it's our duty to tell if somebody who had access to public funds or if somebody who had been part of a government or had some sort of a jurisdictional power was doing something wrong.
The mandate of La Prensa was to return freedom of expression to the country as an infrastructure for democracy in the midst of dictatorship.
Que nunca hemos sido, que no somos, ni nunca seremos, ni Estado asociado, ni colonia o protectorado.
But somehow it worked. And in 6 months, we were the newspaper of record of Panama. When we sat at our first editorial meeting after everything was set up, we said, well, how are we going to handle this? Do we go softly increasing our pressure, or do we hit them straight in the face from day one? We decided the second.
When we heard Mossack Fonseca, we knew that we were uniquely positioned within the project because I played for the Mossack Fonseca softball team in the BVI. 4 of our closest friends worked for Mossack Fonseca. And so we had a perspective that out of the journalists, there were 2 people that knew the inner workings of that company better than anybody. My journalism career was never going to lead to any kind of greatness. I was never going to work for the New York Times. You know, I was the English editor of La Prensa in Panama. That's not the sort of things that make a great bio. And I always compared it to a career minor league pitcher that suddenly you get to start Game 7 of the World Series. When you find out it's world leaders, it's drug traffickers. The Reina del Sur, who is one of the most famous female narco-terrorists in history. Carlos Quintero, who was described as making Pablo Escobar look like a baby. All of these names that come flooding at you, and your first thought is, how did they get away with this?
Why did they come to you specifically? Is it because you were in this space already and they just kind of knew of you as someone who was interested in this world?
At least that's my assumption. I mean, we've been working on offshore since fall 2012. My private explanation, more or less, is that I know that the source had contacted other outlets even before me, and they had not reacted in the way the leaker wished they had.
Some outlets may have passed just because they tend not to do giant collaborations. You're devoting some of your best people to something that might take a year. The resources are scarce. Investigative talent on your payroll is scarce, it's expensive, and you're taking a leap into something that from the beginning you know is not going to be an exclusive.
The media has failed. In addition to Süddeutsche Zeitung and ICIJ, and despite explicit claims to the contrary, several major media outlets did have editors review documents for the Panama Papers. They chose not to cover them.
There's this probably frustrated person, or those persons, we don't know, trying to reach someone that is actually listening.
I mean, there was a flavour of John Doe's personality. John Doe was worried about exposure. He was also kind of worried about his own sort of personal safety. So we don't know who it is. It could be a he, it could be a she. I don't think it's a they.
I don't think anyone benefits. You know, it's kind of death by 1,000 cuts. If you give a little information here, a little information there, you end up compromising your source. And so I've kind of pushed back internally, I think, on that, so that people are more cautious about what they say about the source.
There are lots of good reasons for sources to be afraid of talking to the press. It can be an enormous risk. You know, they can get fired, they can get jailed in some places, they can get killed. But one of those reasons is they don't trust the operational security of the journalists. And sometimes they're right to be very worried about that. And they should, you know, if you're a source out there, you should do your due diligence and pick your journalists carefully.
I have watched as one after another, whistleblowers and activists in the United States and Europe have had their lives destroyed by the circumstances they find themselves in after shining a light on obvious wrongdoing.
Snowden, who was holed up in Hong Kong, wanted in the U.S., is now in Russia.
Edward Snowden is stranded in Moscow, exiled due to the Obama administration's decision to prosecute him under the Espionage Act. Bradley Birkenfeld was awarded millions for his information concerning Swiss bank UBS, and was still given a prison sentence by the Justice Department. Legitimate whistleblowers who expose unquestionable wrongdoing, whether insiders or outsiders, deserve immunity from government retribution.
Because of its nature and how global it was, we all realized that we need to get together in person. So Munich was the perfect place, of course, because we needed to go to the home of Süddeutsche Zeitung.
That itself had to stay secret, so you couldn't say, I'm in Munich for X. People naturally asked, well, you know, what are you doing there? Oh, a work meeting, or you had to come up with something that didn't sound anything like what you were doing there.
The meeting was kind of the decisive point. It was more or less our job to make people enthusiastic about it and to get them on board. I was so nervous. I hadn't slept for 3 nights because I was really, really nervous because I thought if I mess this up, you know, then this is the big chance.
The biggest collaboration of investigative journalists.
Sitting in front of more than 100 journalists showed me the first time how big this project already was at that moment.
It was like the United Nations of journalism, and I've never experienced anything like it. We were working on a story, and we were all working on it together.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I'm Emilia, I'm from Venezuela. I think
We are not forcing you to do this story. We are not paying you to do this story. This is the story, and you need to invest in it. And you are only going to get out of it as much as you put into it.
Everybody was, I'm all in. I want to know more.
It's a time right now in newsrooms of great uncertainty. You know, what will be the fate of newspapers, which used to be the watchdogs of the media?
And at a time when everyone is broke, when no one's clicking the ads, where Facebook is taking all our money, where newsrooms are just kind of empty-pocketed.
We really had to convince these media organizations and these journalists to work together. And we often got responses like, why do we need you? Or why do we need one another? We can do it on our own. And perhaps 10, 15 years ago, it was pre-media crisis, and a lot of newspapers were feeling pretty strong still, and they still had foreign correspondents and thought that they could do it on their own. But as the crisis in the media took place, and stories became more complex as technology evolved, it became obvious that we needed to join forces. And they learned through the process how much more impactful and powerful their reporting can become when we work as a collective.
We immediately realized the impact of having more people from different countries inside the investigation, because we had more findings.
Generally, I would say we found the anonymous international rich. We found Spanish royals, we found a German chicken farmer, we found a French dentist, we found people who would use fake names when dealing with their lawyers. So instead of saying, hello, here is Ivan, they would say, hi, it's Harry Potter. And there was correspondence, dear Harry, your $25,000 has arrived in the Bahamas. I mean, it was just like the most weird fishing expedition. I mean, there were fish you would expect, and there were some very ugly small fish you didn't expect.
Whenever I went into the data, I found something new. I found scandals in Africa and Latin America.
Messi now, everyone on the edge of their seats. Messi going for goal! He's a man on a mission!
Lionel Messi, his family fortune is in the Panama Papers and is now in the courts. No one in their right mind in Latin America thought that FIFA wasn't corrupt.
Here we go, Seth.
It was not a surprise to find the FIFA officials. That was kind of one of the people thought was going to be in there. Kids are under contract at 13 or 14. Whether or not they've ever become a pro has very little to do with their talent level and more to do with which lawyer is screwing what agent in a business deal. And Lionel Messi, there's no evidence that he himself had any hand in any of this, but the people who handle him and the whole contracts and everything, they did.
And we will restore the image of FIFA and the respect of FIFA. And everyone in the world will applaud us, and will applaud all of you for what we'll do in FIFA in the future.
We found Sergei Roldugin, Putin's best friend, ostensibly second-hand car, not very wealthy, but we found almost $1 billion, going from Bank Russia, which is a kind of crony bank from the regime in St. Petersburg, right through to secret offshore companies, and then a lot of that cash was recycled back into Russia, including into the wedding resort where Putin's daughter, Katerina, got married in 2013. And so from Russia, what we saw was, in a way, what you might call a kind of neo-feudal system. You could see how not just Putin's KGB chums were billionaires, but how the next generation were accumulating assets, marrying each other, dodging American sanctions, and so on.
I mean, if you're Vladimir Putin, you don't go to Mossack Fonseca and say, I want a company in my name. But you'd probably send someone that you trust. And this is exactly how this world works.
When you can set up corporations in such a complex way and changing ownership.
One woman I looked into was Leticia Montoya, a director in 10,969 corporations. Think about that. I mean, she has no idea whatsoever what those corporations do.
It's just a job, but she's a secretary. Those who went to her house could have seen that she has no money. She lives in a fisherman community, not in the city. I mean, it's not like she made any money out of this.
This has gone on country after country after country. The amounts that are being pulled out are really at the expense of average people who simply can't get services from their government because the money's been flat stolen. I spoke at a conference of the Inter-American Bar Association in Cochabamba, Bolivia. And I tried to say, lawyers' job is to keep people honest, and you shouldn't be helping them evade the law or break the law. My audience began to laugh at me. I blew up. Why do you think you don't have clean water? Why do you think people are so poor? It's because you, as a group of professionals, are teaching people how not to be participants in your society.
The fundamental question that I ask is, well, who makes money off this? Who makes money off this industry? And obviously Mossack Fonseca made a lot of money. And obviously their clients who avoid taxes, they make a lot of money. But banks also make a lot of money. Financial institutions, Wall Street. You can't have a major business if you don't have banks complicit with your business.
The banks are certainly a key cog in this whole mechanism set up to create distance between the real owners of the money and the corporations that nominally have control over it. But banks donate a lot to politicians. And, you know, there you go.
The banks and the accounting firms and the law firms, they are basically spending all of their resources in trying to damage national treasuries, in creating an illusion of an economic system that works only for the 1%. And they are working to deepen that gap between the 1% and the rest of the world.
We found David Cameron's dad in the data with his offshore fund.
I'm very relaxed about publishing these things. There's no secrets about my status. I am paid handsomely as your Prime Minister, and that is my main source of income. And I have a house I used to live in before I moved into Downing Street, and I rent that out and I get the income from that. I don't have other sources of income, so there'll be no surprises in terms of my tax affairs, but I'm very relaxed. As I've always said, nothing's changed.
It wasn't even a surprise that his dad had a fund. It's just that he wouldn't say that he had money in it. In order to not have the fund taxed in the UK, you had to have a majority of foreign directors on the company board. So the third was Swiss, a third were in the Bahamas, and everything was run out of the Bahamas. So they had this army of people just to sign things there. So they were pretending to devise the investment strategy and trade gold and bonds and things like that. But all the instructions were coming by telephone from London.
One of the things we found is not only did Mossack Fonseca have a number of Chinese companies that it registered in Nevada as shell companies, some of those perhaps to do business in the United States, but more likely than not to hide assets somewhere else. Brazil was one of the hottest things, and having been a correspondent there myself, I was very interested in it and working with the Brazilian team.
We found payoffs to politicians. More than $700 million in bribes have been paid.
2/3 of the country's legislature had been tied to offshore companies. Many of the politicians were using shell companies through Mossack Fonseca in Nevada to hide assets they owned back in Brazil. Nobody pays a bribe and says, hey, here's a bribe. They do it through consulting fees, they do it through structured investments, and they do it through shell companies that pay other shell companies.
The papers were very clear that this problem is not limited to small countries in Africa. The problem is huge here in the United States. The tax evasion problem is huge here in the United States.
There were a lot of Americans in Panama Papers, so there's this perception that there weren't. I think what was missing was a Putin-type big name, but the very kind of people you'd expect to be in the Panama Papers were in there. All kinds of SEC fraud, pump and dump, penny stocks, and a lot of hedge funds. Those kind of guys who need that anonymity to make that work, those guys are in here in some significant numbers. And unfortunately, that's gotten easier, not harder, in the aftermath of Trump's election.
I am officially running for President of the United States, and we are going to make our country great again.
having Donald Trump as the President of the United States let me feel a little bit strange, knowing that he also had some offshore deals in his past.
He didn't pay any federal income tax. So
that makes
if
me
he's
smart.
paid zero.
Trump is obviously one we were focused on from the very beginning. He appeared about 3,450 times that we know of. That's not to say his partners, that's just him by name. The big find was a lot of documents around the Panama Hotel project.
Trump Ocean Club soars over the Pacific and Panama City. It's also where criminals, everywhere from Russian gangsters to money launderers for Latin American drug cartels, were able to hide their cash.
There we found contract information between him and the developer Newland. One of the things I think that was very helpful in the Panama Papers is it actually showed Trump's business model. It was a contract that showed how he got paid, how his name was leased. This really wasn't known. And the documents, here we had physical proof of how he arranges things.
As a former money launderer, the Trump Ocean Club, how would you rate it in its quality?
Money laundering?
For money laundering.
I'd say AAA. You get control of the country, you move your family into all of the important jobs in the country, and then you use that as an opportunity to enrich yourself.
The man they credit with Donald Trump's victory, the president-elect's own son-in-law, Jared Kushner.
What's now going on is exactly that. And what I think is also going on is that our president has cozied up to any number of these kleptocrats because he wants Americans to think it's the new normal.
He's a central figure in the investigations into Donald Trump's inner circle and possible ties to Russia.
It was Manafort, Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort.
Long before he was President Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort was paid millions by a Russian billionaire with close ties to Vladimir Putin.
That is the closest we've been able to get to Manafort. Manafort seems to have been paid through companies in Belize. I've spent a lot of time looking at these shell companies.
Donald Trump's friends, people of his cabinets, advisors, have been active in the offshore business.
Mr. Mnuchin, you ran a hedge fund for a few years starting in 2004, and I've been trying to get my arms around the Mnuchin web of bank accounts and shell companies. They were in the Cayman Islands, in Anguilla. How many employees did you have in Anguilla?
We didn't have any employees in Anguilla.
How many customers did you have there?
We didn't have any customers that resided in Anguilla.
Did you have an office there?
We did not have an office ourselves there.
So you just had a post office box?
Senator, let me explain to you.
It's just a yes or no answer. I'm already over my time. Yes or no? Did you just have a post office?
Well, hopefully the other senators will defer some time so I can answer this for you because I think it's an important issue.
Mr. Chairman, I think you should go ahead and answer it right now.
You have a chance to answer the question.
Yeah. I'm very troubled about this question of how you're going to unrig the system if you've got a record of taking advantage of tax shelters that, in effect, have a 0% tax rate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The taxes you pay are compulsory. They come out of your paycheck. You can see it once or twice a month. There are no Cayman Island deals for you, none of those kind of sweetheart overseas deals for you the way Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, got. Then there's another set of tax rules for the fortunate and the well-connected. They can pretty much decide under the tax law what they're going to pay, when they're going to pay it, and in some instances, almost nothing.
The problem today is really that the U.S. is the best place to put your assets.
Over the last couple of decades, we've seen increasingly that shell companies registered in the U.S. are used to commit all sorts of crimes, from human trafficking to drug trafficking to arms dealing. The list goes on and on.
Looking to Delaware, looking to Nevada, and that's, for example, a jurisdiction where Mossack Fonseca was very active.
We found a lot of Brazilians hiding property owned in Brazil through Nevada offshore. So Nevada was being used by Brazilians in a way that Cayman Islands, Bahamas might be used by an American trying to hide ownership of an asset.
Well, Nevada has always had this approach to raising revenue that we want to tax somebody else, not the people who live here. Back in the 90s, they decided to become the Delaware of the West and tried to follow that example and make it very easy for shell companies, LLCs, to be set up there without having any kind of information available about who owned them or who benefited from them. I said at the time that it was might as well hang up a shingle and say, welcome scumbags and sleazeballs, because those are the kind of people who want to keep their information secret. But it became a source of revenue, so you didn't have to raise taxes.
What's your long view?
Well, I'm afraid they're rolling back the protections that were put in Dodd-Frank, and a lot of that was about accountability and transparency. Banks fought that, so they're certainly not going to want to open it up any further.
You can find tax havens all around the world. They are in the US, they are in the UK.
Now, having done 6 of these projects, I would say with some certainty that probably the biggest tax haven in the world is Britain and its former colonies.
We're open for business. We like oligarchs. I don't want to exaggerate and say we're just a tax haven, but the state is captured by finance.
Close behind it is America, and I think in the future it would be great if someone gave us, Delaware leaks. We would uncover secrets that may have been bigger than anything we've ever done before.
I call on the European Commission, the British Parliament, the United States Congress, and all nations to take swift action, not only to protect whistleblowers, but to put an end to the global abuse of corporate registers. Tax evasion cannot possibly be fixed while elected officials are pleading for money from the very elites who have the strongest incentives to avoid taxes relative to any other segment of the population.
I was actually concerned every day about the security of this whole project, because let's face the facts, journalists like to speak about their work.
Every journalist you bring in, they're probably going to tell their life partner, they're probably going to tell their best friend, so their risks were going up exponentially every time you brought somebody in.
We were so focused on the digital part that I think you forget that a lot of journalists are going to need to have interviews with sources, and they're going to have these interviews in bars or in cafes or in public places, and they're not going to be conscious of the fact that other people might be following them or listening to their conversation.
It's funny, really, because to extract secrets from a journalist, you just need to take the journalist to the bar, buy the journalist a beer, or maybe 2 beers if they're being kind of tricky, and they will tell you everything.
My colleagues say, I haven't seen any stories, what are you doing? I say, it's a project. It's a regional project, actually worldwide, and we're just looking at something. I said, well, when's it coming out? Well, I couldn't really answer.
You had this in mind the whole time, that one mistake could jeopardize the whole project.
My life during all those months was kind of like a spy life. I couldn't tell them what I was doing, and I felt awful, because at the same time I was investigating my friends. I would go to dinner parties, and during the day I was just searching documents that somehow mentioned them.
We felt responsible for their safety, and that was also something we repeatedly told our colleagues. Be aware that there's colleagues of us out there risking their life with this reporting, and if you tell too much, you could risk their life.
In the last weeks before our publication date, we had to do everything to protect our source. So we stopped all communications. We destroyed effectively the devices that we used to communicate with the source, my iPhone and my computer. We deleted all the files with several programs, so we ran it over and over and over and until it was completely flat. But then again, we weren't really sure, if you really can trust this. So I more or less took a hammer and started smashing the things. We didn't want to throw it away because we were so paranoid back then that we thought if someone finds it, maybe he can do something with it.
The most dangerous moment in the investigation and the most tense moment when we start reaching out to people for comment. If we have had a year to look at your bank information and your company information, we are not going to surprise you.
You don't approach people and say, listen, dear team of Mossack Fonseca, you lost all your data.
The camera crews for the broadcasters involved in the project descended on the offices of Mossack Fonseca in Panama City and demanded to talk to someone, get a statement.
Pero usted me acaba de decir que no nos van a atender. Yo quiero saber quién le dijo que no nos va a atender. ¿Qué persona? ¿No sabe?
We sent them an email. We saw documents that seemed to indicate that you have many troubles with your due diligence and the way you choose your customers. Then it follows a long list of questions, very detailed, very much into the cases. So they said, we're not involved in illegal dealings. We have never contact with the customers directly. We only work with intermediaries, which are lies.
I feared, wow, now everything might blow up. Now it will be hundreds of lawyers trying to stop our reporting. Hundreds of people all around the world get knowledge about our investigation, and that's people like drug lords, criminals. And of course we feared that something may happen.
It was very stressful for all of us because at that point, yeah, we had to call our sources, we had to call the people that we were writing about, and people started to know more and more and more. We started to have a bodyguard because that's when we received an indirect threat by Mossack Fonseca. So they came and said, we know you have a journalist who's helping the international media, and she's being paid for, and she is trying to diminish the reputation of our firm and the country, and she's going to have to, suffer the consequences. So the paper immediately said, you can't be around without any protection. My friends are here. We go pick them up at the hotel, and there's a bodyguard there, driving the car. So we said, well, it's just an Uber. But we forgot to hide the gun he had in the middle of the front seats. We had to live a double life, in that really was something that changed our lives from that moment.
The most frightening moment for me shortly before publication was when I personally had to write an email to the Kremlin, basically addressing it to dear Mr. Vladimir Putin and laying out what we have found in regards to this net of companies around his friend Sergei Roldugin that was funneling hundreds of millions of dollars out of Russia. And I've never written an email to Vladimir Putin before. Some days later, Vladimir Putin's spokesperson, Mr. Peskov, did a press conference in Moscow.
Documents show nothing about Mr. Putin. Everything that was interconnected with our president was written by newspapers and was written by journalists without having obvious facts for that.
It was clear to me, oh shit, he's speaking about that email I sent some days ago.
In our understanding, this is nothing else but a reflection of, let's say, an overwhelmed Putinophobia disease that unfortunately is quite spread now in in lots of media.
It was clearly obvious that the Kremlin was pissed off.
We got a lot of legal threats, and there were so many, they were really piling up. Everyone that we contacted recruited the best lawyers to threaten ICIJ, to try to get us to show them documents, to try to get us to not publish the story.
Drug trafficking, income inequality, poverty. You look at those problems in the world, and a lot of the keys to addressing those problems are in the Panama Papers. Even though you feel like you may wake up one day and have somebody in your bedroom pointing a gun at you, you feel like you have to keep going on this because it's too important.
So coming from Iceland, I knew that if I would start asking questions about the offshore company of the Prime Minister early, then all the alarm bells would ring inside the government and inside the institutions here in Iceland. So we had to find a way to get the reactions from the Prime Minister on camera. So we decided, after a lengthy talk about the ethical issues, to confront him.
Mr. Prime Minister, what can you tell me about a company called Vintris?
Well, it's a company, if I recall correctly, which is associated with one of the companies that I was on a board of, and had an account, which, as I mentioned, has been with the tax on the tax account since it was established. So now I'm starting to feel a bit strange about these questions, because it's like you are accusing me of something when you are asking me about a company that has been on my tax return.
Yeah, but it must be okay for me as a journalist to ask the Prime Minister about personal...
But you are indicating that I have not paid taxes on it.
No, I'm just asking you questions.
Okay.
But to go into the details, I would like my partner to do it in Icelandic, because I don't have the details to discuss it.
Akkur hefur ekki sagt frá
því að þú væri tengdur... Ég skal taka þetta viðtalið þið sjálf, en sérstaklega...
Akkur hefur ekki sagt frá því að þú væri tengdur aflandsfélaginu Vintris?
Herru, ég skal veita þér þetta viðtal...
Við erum í viðtalinu núna, Sigmundur. Þú getur svarað, þú ert forsætisráðherra þjóðarinnar. En hvaða eignir eru í félaginu? Hvaða eignir eru í félaginu?
Ég meina, þú byrð ekki...
Við vitum um það að Vintris var kröfuhafi og er kröfuhafi í föllnu bönkunum.
Þannig að þið erum að gera eitthvað tortryggilegt sem að er ekki tortryggilegt.
Vita félaginu er í indefense að þú hafir átt aflandsfélag sem var kröfuhafi.
Hvaða atriði ertu að búa til hérna?
Sigmundur, þú hlýtur að geta svarað þessum spurningum. Þú ert forsætisráðherra, þú hefur ekki komið hreint fram. The time between the interview and the publication was a stressful time. The wife of the Prime Minister, she posted a Facebook status talking about some attacks from the media. Soon I realized that we shouldn't be afraid, because we had all the materials, we had the interview, and I told my staff, you know, just relax, because we are going to publish this and it will be big.
We were utterly convinced that night that we were going to light the blue touch paper. Despite nobody going beforehand, there was still an air of expectancy. People knew a big story was coming.
What was weird was about 10 minutes before we were due to press send, Edward Snowden tweeted out a link to the English language website of Süddeutsche Zeitung.
The people who follow him then were alerted to this, and that's a pretty wide universe.
Gerald Rowell, the director of the ICIJ, is hammering the phones, getting everyone to just hold their nerve.
I thought it was very important that we all hold the line, that what was happening with press conference from the Kremlin and what was happening in Iceland at the time, where parts of the story were getting out through Facebook, through the Icelandic Prime Minister's wife, Like there was a lot of nervousness, and I really thought that all of these events, all of these small things happening, even though, you know, we were being talked about a week beforehand, no one really knew the bigger story.
You know, I remember describing it a bit like a general standing at the top of the hill, holding back the troops, you know, waiting as the opposing army approaches, you know, hold, go, charge.
When that day hits, things happen very quickly.
The so-called Panama Papers now exposing the secret financial dealings of politicians and celebrities.
Many of the world's most powerful politicians, wealthy business owners, and popular celebrities are now desperately trying to distance themselves from the fallout and consequences of the Panama Papers.
There was an immediate response on social media.
They're all on the inside. We're out on the street looking in. Hello.
This thing exploded and took an entire life of its own.
We turned out of the banking bombshell causing shockwaves around the world.
Panama Papers. Un escándalo internacional.
De Panama, los Panama Papers.
No caso, Panama Papers.
What may be the largest leak of secret documents in history.
A blockbuster release of millions of financial documents.
This is the biggest attack on the tax shelter industry. It's $1 trillion industry.
It is $1 trillion industry.
The UK, France, Australia, Mexico all say they're going to investigate.
When it blew up, I had no idea the size of the situation.
Panama police have raided the offices of the law firm at the center of the country's massive data leak.
No podemos hablar de qué delitos. Lo que sí es que nosotros tenemos que hacer nuestro trabajo e incautar esta información para examinarla.
Now the problem is, can the various judicial systems of the world handle all of this material without getting a horrendous case of indigestion?
Ramón Fonseca Mora con nosotros esta mañana. Muchísimas gracias por aceptar la invitación.
El medio o el periodista o el sensacionalista, hay un crimen. Un señor le meten un cuchillo. El periodista, en vez de investigar al señor del cuchillo, va a la fábrica del cuchillo y decir, a buscar el culpable.
We have always dealt with professional clients all over the world, only.
After the publication, the example they gave, we're like a knife factory. You know, we sell the knives. If people kill other people with knives, it is not our fault. The problem is they always knew who had the knives and what were they going to do with the knives.
The law firm is denying any wrongdoing.
When we realized how big it was when we saw people going out in the streets.
Thousands of Icelanders took to the streets calling on the Prime Minister to resign following allegations he benefited from offshore holdings in tax havens.
The first casualty of the Panama Papers has fallen. The Prime Minister of Iceland yielded his post on Tuesday amid public uproar that he failed to disclose links to an offshore company.
Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. He may be thrown out of office over allegations that his family owns several illegal offshore businesses.
Corruption and bribery at the highest level. On the streets of Rio, Sao Paulo and dozens of other cities, protesters laid the blame at the door of President Dilma Rousseff.
Every day there is a new scandal. Every day there is something related to money being taken out of the country.
We have some breaking news from Brazil, where the Senate there has voted to impeach President Dilma Rousseff and plunges the country into political chaos.
Look at Brazil. That's probably the country where the Panama Papers has had the most impact. Iceland got the headlines for the president. The entire ruling structure of Brazil is crumbling because so many of them are tied into this money laundering scheme.
Protesters in the Argentine capital, Buenos Aires, are calling for the country's president to step down after the so-called Panama Papers revealed Mauricio Macri is on the board of two offshore firms, one in the Bahamas, the other in Panama.
Several thousand people filled a square in Malta's capital on Sunday and demanded the resignation of Prime Minister Joseph Muscat.
My mother was in Malta alone, fighting this, with no one backing her at all, no institution.
Daphne had been working on a number of post-Panama Papers stories. She wasn't involved in the Panama Papers investigation itself, but she had taken our reporting and gone further.
The management of consultancy and brokerage business.
Good evening. Today, yesterday's leaks.
I had confronted Conrad Mitzi, the energy minister, saying, can you give us more details about the Panama company? What's it called?
There are no bank accounts. No funds.
He was you could tell he was just buying for time and trying to see what Daphne knew, what we knew. And when I asked what the name of the company is, he said, I can't remember because it's a technical name.
And there are absolutely no funds. Thank you.
When the story broke, they didn't resign. I couldn't believe it. I could see, it was like a disaster unfolding in slow motion.
Mal-ewwel okkażjoni fis-sigħat li ġejjin kemm jien kemm Marti nibdew proċeduri legali tal-libel u ħanieħdu pariri legali fuq ir-reputazzjoni tagħna kontra is-Sinjura Karwana Galizja u kontra il-mezzi tax-xandir tal-kap tal-Oppożizzjoni talli qegħdin jirrepetu din il-gidba faħxija.
British Prime Minister David Cameron faces backlash to implications in the recently leaked Panama Papers.
And that's when things in the UK just went really crazy.
There was turmoil in this country. David Cameron had the worst week.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I would like to make a statement on the Panama Papers. Dealing with my own circumstances first, yesterday I published all the information in my tax returns, not just for the last year, but for the last 6 years. I've also given additional information about money inherited and given to me by my family, so people can see the sources of income that I have. This is an entirely standard practice, and it is not to avoid tax.
May I thank the Prime Minister for the advanced sight of his statement. It is absolutely a masterclass in the art of distraction.
He refused to say whether he'd had any money in his father's offshore fund.
He'd gone on record as saying we've got to end secrecy about tax avoidance. He'd gone on record saying we've got to shine a light on where this money comes from.
Some of these schemes where people are parking huge amounts of money offshore and taking loans back to just minimise their tax rates, it is not morally acceptable.
So he then had to come out, and this was the fourth or fifth explanation over the period of 3 days, saying, well, in actual fact, I did benefit from the shares.
Samantha and I had a joint account, and we owned 5,000 units in Blairmore Investment Trust, which we sold in January 2010. That was worth something like £30,000.
Was there a profit on it?
I'd paid income tax on the dividends, but there was a profit on it, but it was less than the capital gains tax allowance, so I didn't pay capital gains tax, but it was subject to all the UK taxes in all the normal ways.
A few months later, Britain was going to hold a referendum on whether to leave the European Union.
People of Britain have spoken, voting for a British exit, dubbed Brexit, with almost 52% of the votes choosing to leave the 28-member European Union.
And Cameron was the figurehead for Remain, but the British press is dominated by press barons who wanted us to leave. And it suited their agenda to destroy the figurehead for Remain.
On Wednesday, I would attend the House of Commons for Prime Minister's questions, and then after that, I expect to go to the Palace and offer my resignation, so we'll have a new Prime Minister in that building behind me by Wednesday evening. Thank you very much.
Cameron helped to create this moral atmosphere which said, look, this behaviour is wrong and should not be helped by the laws that we have in existence at the moment.
The documents show allies to Russian President Vladimir Putin secretly shuffled as much as $2 billion through banks and shadow companies.
Day one, of course, was Vladimir Putin and the $2 billion worth of money that led back to him, which was a remarkable story. It's been one of international journalism's holy grails, really, that story.
The papers revealed the identity of a suspiciously rich cellist, which raises immediate red flags for me, because I always thought the only way to make millions with a cello is to use it to dig for gold.
Информация достоверная. У Сергея Павловича уже ничего нет, потому что он на приобретение этих инструментов истратил
больше денег, чем у него было. И остался должен даже тем структурам, тем фондам, через которые он это покупал. Но кто этим занимается, вот этими провокациями? Ну, вот, мы знаем, что там есть сотрудники американских официальных учреждений. Чем ближе к выборам, тем больше будет таких вбросов.
You know, he's basically saying, we're all spies. We scheme dastardly stuff to try and defame the Russian Federation. Now, of course, that isn't the case. And if it were a CIA plot, how come David Cameron got sucked in? How come no demonstrations in Iceland and Argentina?
I mean, the hilarious thing, was that Putin ended up having to buy lots of cellos. Well, Dugin bought lots of cellos because he said it was for buying cellos, so they went and bought a lot of cellos after.
This wasn't on official news in Russia. Unless you were looking at foreign media, you had no idea that the Panama Papers broke. The officials who were implicated in these documents would retaliate against journalists. It's real. Journalists have been killed.
A car exploded in flames in the Ukrainian capital of Kiev early Wednesday morning. Inside, a prominent journalist, Pavel Sheremet. An eyewitness to the blast says several people tried to pull Sheremet from the car, but it appeared he was already dead.
In Russia, journalists, both in the big cities and the provinces, get killed, shot, beaten to death. Roman Lenin, who works for Novaya Gazeta, he was kind of instrumental in following the money all the way to Putin and making that kind of connection.
Но я глубоко убежден, что он правда не погружен в работу всех этих офшоров. Он, безусловно, о них знает, потому что он подписывал документы от их имени. Безусловно, в России никто не будет ничего смотреть и расследовать.
The Kremlin pretty soon found out who our Russian partners are, so there was TV programs that basically screened something like wanted posters of the two of them, putting out information on them, detailed information that could lead people to the place where they work or potentially where they live. They, to a certain point, left Russia for a while.
We were treated as traitors. There were publications all over the social networks and everywhere blaming us for selling our country, blaming us for treason. They were people saying, what should we do with the traitor journalists? With our names, they said, well, should we throw them off the bridge of the canal? Should we send them to Punta Coco, which is the equivalent of Alcatraz for Panama? Or should we just send them to La Jolla, which is a maximum security prison?
This sort of thing is happening. It's a lot of places in the world. It's absolutely terrifying. Me personally, I've been physically threatened. I've been threatened with lawsuits. But I'm really lucky. I work in the United States. It's really bad form to kill a journalist here. Investigative journalism is hard enough without having to do all that kind of moral math, physical risk. It's something that war correspondents are used to doing all the time. In a way, it kind of feels like we're all war correspondents now.
This just shows how vulnerable reporters around the world working on corruption issues are. One answer to that vulnerability is working in networks and in teams. You can't take down 376 reporters.
For the Panama Papers, reporting that explored the hidden infrastructure and global scale of offshore tax havens. The Pulitzer Prize in explanatory reporting goes to the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, McClatchy, and the Miami Herald.
Just the idea that we were able to finish the Panama Papers despite all of the doubts and publish it along with all of these other reporters all across the world.
And it felt so surreal because the Pulitzer is something you always dream of as a journalist, but as a German journalist, it's something that you can normally not reach.
It's nice to show that journalists can actually work together, and I think that's something that we always thought would never happen. Journalists are selfish, we don't share stories, we don't share sources. We've just proven that that's wrong, that in fact you get a better story sometimes if you do share.
You do need big international teams to cover big international topics.
Then it cleared the way for us to spend the rest of the year really doing the kind of stuff that you couldn't do on the first day, but were just as important as the first day's stories.
I thought that this would be the time when we can refocus and go into the stories we hadn't yet the time to finish. But then we heard this terrible news from Malta where Daphne Galizia was killed in a car bombing.
The son of the investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was killed in a car bomb attack in Malta, has attacked the island as a mafia state run by what he called crooks. His 53-year-old mother, who was killed yesterday, was known for her blog accusing politicians of high-level corruption, and he led the Panama Papers investigation into corruption on the island.
We couldn't have been more shocked when we found out that Daphne, Matthew's mother, had been blown up. I mean, it just seems so senseless and crazy.
The message was, look, we can do this and we can get away with it. There's no deterrent. We can strike whoever we want, whenever we want, and get away with it.
The fact that she was killed in Malta, you're talking about a European country that really shocked not just us, but also the world.
This what happened to Daphne. We never thought anything could happen in Malta. Daphne was, very much a fearless investigator. A lone voice in a sense. She was very frustrated with the mainstream media. And people just gravitated towards her blog naturally.
Daphne was fierce, and she was a blogger, so she had a lot more freedom than newspaper journalists in terms of expressing her opinion, and she used it.
My article went up at 7 o'clock in the evening, and 2.5 hours later, by 9:30, the police were already at my gate with a warrant for my arrest issued by a magistrate within 2.5 hours. The police cannot understand why I will not abide by the law and sit at home quietly and not write anything about politics.
She was one addressing things many politicians did not want to hear.
She wrote about corruption at the highest levels of government. I mean, I always get, the usual people, don't worry, the truth will come to light, good always wins, there will be justice. My mother always thought that was bullshit.
She wasn't just outspoken, she was effective. And I think that's why she's been killed. What was particularly shocking was that for some people, this assassination was a cause for celebration. One police officer actually tweeted that he was pleased that this had happened and called her cow dung the day after. So, there wasn't universal condemnation of this act in Malta as perhaps there should have been.
A court in Malta has charged 3 men with the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia. Maltese media say the authorities homed in on the suspects following telephone intercepts. Police arrested 10 men on Monday in connection with the killing. 7 have been released on bail pending further inquiries.
It was just all a big show. I'm quite confident that they were the people who executed the orders to assassinate my mother, but my mother never wrote about them. She never investigated them. She had no idea who they were. They've probably never even read what she wrote.
They may have been the people who pushed the button, who set off the bomb, but they're definitely not the masterminds, and they definitely wouldn't have had the motive to do it. So the big question is, who ordered this kill, and ultimately who paid them as well.
The way it was done was also a way of getting sources to stop talking.
The two founders of Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca were arrested after both were indicted on charges of money laundering.
Estos papeles es de una firma de abogados. Una firma de abogados que no significa que son 4 millones de habitantes en Panamá.
Where are we with the investigation on Mossack and Fonseca and their potential prosecution?
Es una investigación compleja. La investigación inició, la investigación no ha concluido. Que en estas causas hay procesados, que en estas causas hay dinero incautado, que en estas causas las personas directamente señaladas fueron objeto de formulación de cargos, sus oficinas y domicilios fueron allanados, se le incautó material, se ordenó la detención provisional de estas personas, pero los tribunales dieron fianza y en estos momentos pues no están dentro del proceso, pero en libertad.
Porcel, I think, is trying to do what has to be done, but the judiciary, which is where she has to deposit her investigations, has zero credibility at this point. If you talk to Panamanians out there about this, the reaction is, no pasa nada, nothing will happen. I don't think that's right. I think that something will happen. We have an ex-president of the Supreme Court in jail. We have an ex-president in jail in Miami. I mean, there are things happening. I feel that somewhere along the way, in incremental bits, we'll be solving these problems. It's just a human problem that we have to face all over the world.
This is not only about Panama, that's a worldwide problem, and if it should get solved, it's something that has to be addressed in the US as well.
One of the things that led to change on the US end, that both Nevada and Wyoming changed their laws based on some of what we were able to show about these nominee directors that really weren't contacts. And the UK government is now supporting efforts to force transparency in overseas tax havens that do that by introducing public registries across the Commonwealth countries.
Inglés y Marta lo va a tener que reformar aún más para una audiencia en inglés.
Perfecto.
Panama Papers hasn't ended yet. It's still going. Every week there's a new Panama Papers development. Reporters are still in the database, are still searching, are still finding things that we missed.
While there have been a lot of investigations launched, including in the US, and there have been a number of people all across the world who have been arrested, there has been an element of inaction in areas that really matter, reform that would prevent these offshores from being created in the way they are created. There was a lot of talk about it, but yet that hasn't happened in a significant way.
I think history has shown that the importance the Panama Papers are in revealing this kind of underbelly of global finance and how it ties into the whole inequality question. I think it also will probably lead to a better mousetrap.
Will the scams go on? Will there be new ways found? Yes, of course. You know, the world will probably just get a bit more sophisticated.
There's a democratic backsliding in the world in general, and I think that this is taking journalism down with it. It's kind of strange that at the same time it's a golden age for investigative journalism. Our work has never been as important as it is now.
The horrific magnitude of detriment to the world should shock us all awake. But when it takes a whistleblower to sound the alarm, it is cause for even greater concern. It signals that democracy's checks and balances have all failed, that the breakdown is systemic, and that severe instability could be just around the corner. So now is the time for real action.